Welcome. Get comfortable wherever you are. Lie down if you haven't already. Pull something over you if the room is cool. Tonight we're going to move through the story of something so familiar that most of us have stopped noticing it. A company. A set of golden arches. A smell that arrives before you've even opened the door. This is the story of McDonald's. Not the version with dramatic music and a narrator who sounds like he's announcing the end of the world. Just the story, told slowly, in the right order, with most of the parts that usually get left out. It covers about 70 years of history. Some of it is surprising. Some of it is genuinely strange. A lot of it happened without anyone particularly marking the moment. Part 1. A small town in New Hampshire. The 20th century is young. America is restless. Cars are becoming a real part of daily life. Not everywhere yet, but the roads are stretching and people are beginning to move in ways that would have seemed impractical a generation earlier. The country hasn't quite settled into itself, still feeling along the edges of what it might become. In Manchester, New Hampshire, two brothers are growing up. Richard McDonald and his brother Morris. Morris, who everyone calls Mac. Ordinary kids in an ordinary city, with nothing about their early lives that hints at what their name would eventually mean to several billion strangers. The McDonald family weren't wealthy. Their father worked at a shoe factory for most of his life. Steady work, honest work, the kind that keeps a household running without leaving much surplus. The boys understood early that money required effort, and that effort required showing up. Whether or not that early understanding shaped what came later is one of those questions that can't really be answered. But it's the kind of background detail that tends to matter. In the 1930s, they do what a lot of young Americans do during that difficult, restless decade. They head west. California is pulling people. Los Angeles, especially. It has that quality in those years of feeling like a place where something is perpetually about to begin. The brothers find work connected to the film industry, not in front of cameras, but in the operational and logistical roles that studios needed filling. Backstage, more or less. It suited them. Then, at some point that's genuinely hard to pin down, they start thinking about food. Moving from studio work to running a restaurant might look like a random pivot. But they'd spent years watching how people spent their time and money in a city that never quite stopped moving. They'd clocked what people wanted when they were tired and hungry and in a hurry, which, in Los Angeles, is most of the time. In 1940, Richard and Maurice open a restaurant in San Bernardino, about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. They call it McDonald's Barbecue. Around 25 items on the menu. It's a drive-in, which suits the moment. Car culture is ascending fast, and the idea of pulling into a lot, ordering through a window, eating without leaving your seat, felt genuinely modern in 1940. A small luxury, or maybe just a convenience that the era was ready for. San Bernardino is a working city, a rail hub, a place where goods move through and people stop. The customers aren't particularly upscale. Working families, travelers, people after something decent and affordable. The brothers understand their market without having to study it, because they're not far removed from it themselves. The restaurant does well enough. Not spectacularly, but they're watching. What they gradually figure out is that the vast majority of their revenue is coming from 5 things: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, milkshakes, soft drinks. Everything else, the barbecue, the rest of the menu, barely moves. In practice, they have a 5-item menu with filler. Most customers have decided what they want before they've even looked at the board. They want a burger and fries. They've wanted that since before they pulled in. Obvious in hindsight. Always is. In 1948, they closed the restaurant. Not because it's failing. They close it to take it apart and rebuild it around a different idea entirely. They call the new system the Speedy Service System. That name is very much of its time, carrying the slightly breathless forward lean of mid-century American optimism. The idea behind it, though, is genuinely significant. They imagined the kitchen as a production line. Each person had one job, one specific, repeatable, learnable task. The person handling the buns wasn't thinking about the fries. The person on the grill wasn't assembling finished orders. Everyone knew their piece of the sequence and did only that. This is borrowed, more or less consciously, from the logic of industrial manufacturing. Henry Ford had applied similar thinking to building cars decades earlier. The brothers applied it to a kitchen, which sounds more straightforward than it was. A kitchen is messier and more variable than a factory floor, and reorienting one around production line logic required rethinking every surface, every piece of equipment, every workflow. They reportedly chalked the new layout out on a tennis court first and walked their staff through the motions before a single fryer was installed. The result, a hamburger that had previously taken several minutes could now be ready in under a minute. The price dropped. The weight nearly vanished, and every burger tasted exactly the same. Every time. Not similar. The same. Predictability, it turned out, was enormously appealing. Maybe more appealing than anyone had consciously understood before. When the world feels uncertain, the thing in your hand being precisely what you expected has a particular value. There's a whole theory of consumer psychology hiding inside that. But you don't need the theory. The redesigned restaurant reopens and attracts attention. Other entrepreneurs start approaching the brothers, wanting to open their own versions. The brothers are happy to license the name and share the system, but they're not particularly interested in chasing expansion. They're craftsmen, really. They care about San Bernardino. They care about getting the thing right. A global empire built around their surname is not something they appear to have spent much time thinking about. That part of the story belongs to someone else entirely. Part 2. The Man with the Milkshake Machines. Ray Kroc is 52 years old when he first hears about McDonald's. 52. The rest of what Kroc does tends to get told as though he were young and hungry and just starting out. But he isn't. He's a middle-aged salesman who has worked hard for most of his adult life, with moderate success, and no particular reason to expect that to change. At this point, he sells a piece of equipment called the multi-mixer, a machine that can make 5 milkshakes simultaneously. He travels the country, visiting restaurants and diners, demonstrating the device, trying to convince owners it will improve their business. Not glamorous. He's good at it, but it isn't where he'd imagined ending up. Then he processes an order that makes him stop and read it again. A restaurant in San Bernardino has ordered 8 multi-mixers. 8. That's the capacity to produce 40 milkshakes at the same time. Kroc cannot think of a single restaurant in America that would need to make 40 milkshakes simultaneously. He decides he needs to go and see this place. He drives to San Bernardino, pulls up outside a modest building with a pair of golden arches. There's a line, not a crowd, a line, calm, orderly, moving. Families, workers on lunch breaks, teenagers, people of all kinds, filing through with a rhythm Kroc had genuinely never seen before. The food was reaching people almost as soon as they'd asked for it, and they were leaving. This is the detail he came back to repeatedly in later accounts. They were leaving satisfied, not vaguely content, actually satisfied, in the way people are when something works exactly as it should. He stands there and watches for a long time. What registers for him isn't just the speed, the whole system works, and it works in a way that could, this is the thought forming as he stands in that car park, be done anywhere, any city, any state, any country. He described the moment in his memoir, years later, as something close to a revelation. Whether or not that's how it actually felt in the moment, or whether memory added drama to an experience that was more gradual than instantaneous, it's hard to say. What's clear is that something shifted in him that afternoon in San Bernardino that didn't shift back. He meets the brothers. The conversation goes about as you'd expect when someone arrives burning with a vision the other party doesn't entirely share. They're cautious. They've already tried licensing to a handful of operators with uneven results. They worry about their name attached to something substandard. Kroc is persistent in a particular way. Not pushy exactly, but with a kind of unrelenting warmth that's hard to say no to. He's not threatening. He simply will not stop believing. In 1954, they reach an agreement. Kroc becomes the franchise agent for McDonald's, authorized to open new restaurants across the country. His first restaurant opens in April 1955 in Des Plaines, Illinois, a suburb just northwest of Chicago. He is meticulous in a way that is almost exhausting to read about. Repeated trips back to San Bernardino to study the brothers' operation. Notes on things most people wouldn't consider worth noting. The angle of the spatula. The sequence of operations at the grill. The precise temperature of the frying oil. There's something quietly striking about a 52-year-old man choosing to become a student again, not just nominally, but actually. Notebook in hand, in someone else's kitchen, learning from scratch. The Des Plaines restaurant succeeds. Others follow. Then, fairly quickly, a problem appears. Franchisees, the individual operators running each restaurant, are making changes. Small ones, an extra menu item here, an adjusted recipe there. Decisions that seem reasonable in isolation and might genuinely improve a specific restaurant in a specific town. But they're quietly dismantling the thing that gives McDonald's its value. Kroc's reaction to this becomes something close to a guiding philosophy. Every person walking into any McDonald's anywhere should have exactly the same experience. Same taste, same service, same cleanliness, same value. Not pretty good or usually consistent. Always the same, everywhere, without exception. Enforcing that across hundreds and eventually thousands of locations is one of the more formidable operational challenges in the history of the food business. Part 3. The business behind the business. By the late 1950s, McDonald's is growing. But Kroc has a problem that isn't on any menu board. The franchise model as currently structured is barely making money. The fees from operators are modest. The costs of maintaining standards and expanding keep pace with the income. He's working as hard as he has ever worked, and the financial picture is stubbornly flat. Harry Sonneborn arrives at this point. Sonneborn had a finance background, methodical, precise, the kind of thinker who complemented Kroc's energy without duplicating it. He'd previously worked at Tasty Freeze, a soft-serve ice cream chain, which gave him a specific understanding of how franchise economics actually worked in practice, as opposed to how they appeared on paper. And he had an idea that, when you first hear it, sounds almost boring. It was about real estate. Here's the structure he proposed. McDonald's shouldn't only sell hamburgers. McDonald's should control land. The mechanics. McDonald's would lease commercial properties from landlords, then sublease those same properties to the franchisees actually running the restaurants. McDonald's sits in the middle, between the property owner and the operator, and in that position, it collects rent, not from customers buying burgers, from the people building their businesses on McDonald's controlled ground. Every new restaurant that opens isn't just adding to the customer count, it's adding a property to an expanding portfolio. Real estate, unlike a food business, holds value through downturns. It creates a kind of financial bedrock that a restaurant chain alone never could. When a franchisee's performance drops, McDonald's still collects rent. When an individual restaurant closes, McDonald's still owns or controls the location. The hamburger business and the property business are connected, but they're not identical. And that separation turns out to matter enormously. Sonneborn later said, in a line that gets quoted regularly, "We are not technically in the food business. We are in the real estate business," which is either a cynical framing or a precise one, depending on your tolerance for that kind of bluntness. Both, probably. McDonald's has been, for a long time, one of the largest real estate entities in the world. The hamburgers are real and central, but the ground the restaurants sit on is the other story, the quieter one, running underneath everything else. Most of the people eating their lunch in the car park have no idea. Why would they? Part 4. Growing Pains and Growing Places. Through the early 1960s, restaurants are opening across the United States with increasing speed. The system is tightening. Training is being formalized. Kroc, now in his late 50s, is becoming something he almost certainly hadn't anticipated when he drove to San Bernardino with a notebook full of questions about spatula angles. He's becoming a brand, but the relationship with the McDonald brothers is under strain, and the strain only grows. The brothers are content, more than content really. They have a restaurant, a comfortable life, and their name on a growing enterprise. Expansion for its own sake holds no appeal for them. Kroc cannot stop. It's not exactly a character flaw, more like a metabolic condition. The gap between his appetite and theirs is unresolvable, and eventually, something has to give. In 1961, Kroc buys them out for $2.7 million. The brothers take it. They retire, eventually move back to New Hampshire, and the company carrying their name moves forward without them. Richard McDonald will later express bitterness about the deal, specifically about a handshake agreement regarding royalties that Kroc didn't honor. It's one of the less flattering parts of Kroc's story. He was not, by most accounts, a sentimental man when money was in the room. Through the mid-1960s, the things that would become iconic start appearing. Ronald McDonald arrives in 1963, first turning up on Washington, D.C. television advertisements. A clown, cheerful, bright, calibrated to appeal to children. The strategy is patient and long range in a way that advertising rarely is. The child who visits with their family in 1965 brings their own children in 1990, who bring theirs in turn. Brand loyalty, established before the age of 7, runs deep. Sometimes so deep, it stops feeling like brand loyalty and starts feeling like just how things are. The Filet-O-Fish appears in 1965, and the story behind it is worth telling. A franchise operator in Cincinnati named Lou Groen noticed that his restaurant's Friday sales dropped significantly in a predominantly Catholic neighborhood, where many customers were abstaining from meat. He came up with a fish sandwich and brought it to Kroc. Kroc was not immediately enthusiastic. He wanted to add something called the hula burger, a slice of grilled pineapple on a bun. He apparently believed in it with some conviction. They ran a test. On the same Friday, both items were offered at their respective restaurants. The Filet-O-Fish outsold the hula burger by around 23-1. The hula burger was not heard from again. The Big Mac arrives in 1968, developed not from corporate headquarters, but from a franchise operator named Jim Delegati, running restaurants in Pennsylvania. Kroc had concerns about complexity in the kitchen. Customer response overruled him, and it went national. This keeps happening across McDonald's history, worth noting only because it complicates the image of Kroc as the singular visionary behind everything. The products people actually order often didn't come from the top. They came from individual operators, paying attention to what their customers were doing and responding to it. The corporate structure was rigidly centralized. The ideas frequently weren't. Part 5. The Education of an Empire. In 1961, same year as the buyout, McDonald's opens a training facility in the basement of a restaurant in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. They call it Hamburger University. The name earns a gentle smile, which is probably part of the point. The institution itself is serious. Its job is to train franchise operators and managers, not just in procedures, but in the reasoning behind them, the why as well as the how. From its earliest days, the curriculum covered food preparation standards, customer service philosophy, equipment maintenance, cleanliness protocols, and the underlying logic of why each element serves the whole. The degree it awards is a Bachelor of Hamburgerology, which sounds like a joke and represents something that isn't: a thorough, working knowledge of how the whole operation functions from the inside. Hamburger University grew, moved to a proper campus in Oak Brook, Illinois in 1968. Classrooms, laboratories, a genuine educational facility. Eventually became a global institution with campuses in multiple countries, conducting training in more than 24 languages, serving tens of thousands of managers per year. By the 1980s, graduates of Hamburger University were holding senior positions throughout the company. The curriculum had expanded to cover supply chain management, marketing principles, financial planning, a full business education built specifically around the McDonald's context. Some academic institutions began recognizing hamburger university credits toward formal degrees, which was either evidence of genuine academic credibility or simply evidence of how large McDonald's had become. What Croft had worked out, and this may be his most underappreciated insight, is that a franchise system is only as strong as the shared understanding inside it. You can write all the plans, but if the people running the restaurants don't actually live by the standards, then quietly the training wasn't just procedural, it was cultural. The next time, you hand over money at a counter and receive exactly what you expected, in the time you expected it, in a building that looks roughly like the last one. What you're moving through is the downstream result of decades of institutional effort around one idea. Enormous resources went into producing that ordinary transaction. We treat it as nothing, which is, in a way, exactly what McDonald's intended. Part 6. Going global. Through the 1960s, McDonald's grows steadily within the United States. The first international location opens in 1967, not in Europe or Asia, but in Richmond, British Columbia, just across the border from Washington State. A modest beginning. Then 1971 arrives, and suddenly, McDonald's is in Japan, the Netherlands, Germany, Australia, France, and Guam, all in a single year. The pace of it is striking, even in retrospect. Japan becomes a defining chapter. The Japanese expansion was managed through a partnership with a businessman named Den Fujita. Fujita was unusual in the context of Japanese corporate culture. Direct, occasionally blunt, difficult to slow down. He had a theory about McDonald's in Japan that he stated publicly, and it reads as distinctly odd now, though it tells you something about the cultural atmosphere of the time. He believed that if Japanese children ate Western food regularly, their physical stature would, over generations, begin to resemble Western children's. He said this in interviews, apparently with sincerity. Whether or not that theory has any validity, and it's hard to take it seriously, the energy Fujita brought to the enterprise was real. McDonald's Japan grew faster than most people in the company had anticipated. It became one of the most profitable international markets in the company's history. Post-war Japan had a particular relationship with American modernity, drawn to it, influenced by it, and in Fujita's hands, commercially open to it in ways that proved enormously productive. India was a different problem altogether. Serving beef in a country where the majority of the population has deep religious and cultural reasons not to eat it isn't a minor operational question. McDonald's response was to build a parallel menu from the ground up. No beef, no pork, structured around chicken, fish, and vegetables. The Makaloo Tikki, a burger built around a spiced potato and pea patty, became a popular product in its own right. Not a compromise. Something people would order on its own terms, which is a meaningfully different thing. France resisted, loudly, and then didn't. The French relationship with food goes considerably beyond nutrition. Food is identity. Food is culture. When McDonald's arrived, the resistance was genuine, not just consumer preference, but something that felt, to some people, like a philosophical incursion. In 1999, a farmer named José Bové helped dismantle a McDonald's under construction in Milan, in southern France. He was prosecuted. he didn't appear to mind. The protest was theatrical and deliberate. It made international news, and Beauvais became a recognizable symbol of anti-globalization feeling in that moment. France is now one of McDonald's most profitable markets in the world. The French go regularly. They call it McDo, pronounced McDo, with the easy familiarity of something that's simply been absorbed. What happened to the resistance? Some of it became regulatory policy, and those conversations had real impact at the structural level. But at the level of an individual customer at lunchtime, hunger tends to resolve ideology fairly quickly. Part 6b. The art of local belonging. The international expansion, taken as a whole, is more nuanced than it first appears. McDonald's is not simply a product deposited into markets and left to fend for itself. The company spent, and continues to spend, real effort on understanding what local customers will accept and what they won't. In South Korea, rice burgers and bulgogi burgers reflect a palate with no particular interest in pretending it doesn't have its own traditions. In Thailand, the breakfast menu has included corn soup. In Germany, beer has been available at certain locations, unremarkable there, and which would feel very strange almost anywhere else in the McDonald's world. Australia is its own small story. The informal nickname Macca's emerged from everyday speech the way nicknames do, organically, gradually, until it was just what people called it. McDonald's eventually registered it as an official trademark. A company trademarking its own nickname is, actually, no. More accurately, it's a specific kind of success that most brands never come close to. The Philippines complicates the usual narrative. Jollibee, a local fast food chain founded in 1978, is, in the Philippines, more popular than McDonald's. Genuinely more popular. Jollibee serves rice alongside its burgers, offers a sweet-style spaghetti that matches local taste preferences, and has a fried chicken product with a devoted following. McDonald's operates there and does fine, but Jollibee grew there. It's from there. And that turns out to mean something that McDonald's, whatever its scale, can't replicate. In the Middle East, halal certification restructured entire supply chains. Every source of meat, every processing step, every restaurant had to meet a different standard. Running two consistent systems simultaneously across hundreds of locations requires a level of operational discipline that rarely gets acknowledged outside of logistics conferences. The adaptation is not always fast or elegant, but the general direction has been toward learning what each context requires, then adjusting. McDonald's managed to become part of very different landscapes around the world without feeling, most of the time, quite like an intrusion. That's a harder thing to do than it looks. Part 7. The architecture of familiarity. The golden arches. Try to identify the first time you became aware of them. Most people can't, which is the whole point. They don't arrive in memory as something newly encountered. They're just there, part of the visual landscape, pre-installed, part of the background of wherever you grew up. The early McDonald's restaurants were angular and emphatic, bold reds and yellows, hard surfaces and bright light. The color choices were deliberate. Red and yellow together are activating, appetite stimulating, energizing in a way that doesn't encourage lingering. The chairs were comfortable enough for a meal and noticeably uncomfortable for longer than that. The industry has a word for the metric this serves: throughput, the number of customers who can move through a space in a given time. Everything in the early design was quietly built around it. The design has shifted considerably in recent decades. Wood tones, softer seating, lower and warmer light, free Wi-Fi, which changes the whole dynamic of the space. Someone sitting on Wi-Fi at a McDonald's is no longer a throughput problem. They're occupying the space differently, and McDonald's adjusted to accommodate that because the customer changed first. The smell is worth a moment. It arrives before the door opens. That particular mix of frying oil and toasted bread and something faintly sweet, recognizable instantly, bypassing deliberate thought entirely. For a lot of people, it doesn't pull you into the present. It pulls you somewhere earlier. A school holiday, a specific Saturday, a road trip that took longer than anyone planned. The happiness of being somewhere uncomplicated. That kind of association is more durable than most advertising. You can't redesign it or reposition it. It just stays, attached to whatever was happening the first time you encountered it. Part 8. The supply chain you never see. There's an entire world behind McDonald's that's easy to forget exists. When the company changes something, a recipe ingredient, a packaging specification, or it sources its beef, the decision travels outward through a network of suppliers, processors, distributors, and farmers. The ripple is real and often large. McDonald's serves tens of millions of customers every single day. Each of those meals requires ingredients grown somewhere, processed somewhere, moved somewhere, stored somewhere. Making that happen reliably to a consistent standard across more than 100 countries is a genuine achievement. Whatever else you might think about the company, one of the foundational relationships here was between Kroc and J.R. Simplot. John Richard Simplot, an Idaho businessman who had developed a process for freezing French fries before shipping them. At the time, frozen food had an inferiority reputation. Fresh was better, the general assumption went. Kroc was skeptical, but he agreed to test it, and what the testing showed was counterintuitive. The frozen fry was actually more consistent than the fresh one. The reason is in the potato itself. A potato is a living thing. Its water content, sugar content, and starch structure vary with the season, the soil, how long it's been in storage, too much residual sugar, and the fry browns before it's cooked through. Looks done on the outside, isn't? Too much moisture, and you get something limp and dull. The fresh fry, which sounds like the obviously better option, was delivering a slightly different product from batch to batch. The frozen fry, prepared at peak quality and held there, was the same every time. McDonald's moved to frozen fries. The decision restructured the American potato industry. Demand at McDonald's scale drove investment in freezing technology, refrigerated logistics, and potato farming on a scale that hadn't previously existed. The russet Burbank potato, long, starchy, low in sugar, became effectively the McDonald's potato. Agricultural regions reoriented themselves around the relationship. McDonald's is now one of the largest buyers of potatoes anywhere on Earth, which is a genuinely strange sentence that also happens to be true. The supplier model Kroc established early was maintained by his successors. McDonald's didn't want to own the supply chain. It wanted independent suppliers, but ones who grew with McDonald's. The relationship was unequal in terms of power. McDonald's is not a customer you can afford to lose, but it was designed to be mutually dependent. When McDonald's did well, the suppliers did well. When McDonald's demanded higher standards, suppliers had strong incentive to meet them. Keystone Foods is the example usually cited. It began as a modest beef supplier and grew alongside McDonald's, developing proprietary technology for processing and freezing patties at scale, building quality control systems that hadn't existed before the relationship demanded them. By the time the partnership matured, Keystone was producing hundreds of millions of hamburger patties per year. Neither side would call it friendship, but it's a real example of what commercial interdependence looks like when it functions. Part 8. The potato and the fry. The fry deserves its own section because Croc's relationship with it is, you get the sense, genuinely obsessive in a way that went beyond ordinary professional concern. He tasted fries from restaurants across the country and was frustrated by the variation. Not furious, frustrated, persistently. The way you are when something you care about keeps falling short of what you know it can be. The fry was the most ordered item. It was what people came back for. Getting it consistently right was not a minor operational detail, in his view. It was the point. The russet Burbank potato requires specific conditions and specific handling to produce the result Croc wanted. Sugar accumulates in a potato during cold storage, and too much of it causes the fry to brown before it's cooked through. Golden on the outside, underdone inside. Too much moisture means something soft and disappointing. The acceptable window for a fry worth eating is narrower than it looks. McDonald's eventually dictated the growing conditions, harvesting timing, storage temperature, and processing timeline for its potato suppliers. Farmers supplying McDonald's weren't simply growing potatoes. They were growing a specific product to specific parameters. The fry starts in a field, months before anyone orders it. Somewhere in Idaho or Washington or Manitoba. Right now, potato plants are in the ground. The chain that connects that field to a paper sleeve handed through a car window is longer and more deliberate than most people eating the fry will ever have cause to wonder about. Part 9. The figures behind the food. The McDonald's story usually gets told as Ray Kroc's story, and in some respects that's fair. But the company was shaped by people whose names barely come up. Fred Turner joined early as a grill man. He worked through the operation from the ground up, building an understanding of the business that was entirely practical. Learned from doing, not from observing. He became the company's president. Turner developed what became the QSCV standard: quality, service, cleanliness, and value. 4 words that became the internal compass for every decision the organization made. Policy, training, supplier requirements, restaurant design. All of it was meant to serve those 4 values, which sounds simple and isn't at scale. Turner also built a culture of internal promotion. The belief, backed by actual practice, that the person who started behind the counter could, over years, end up managing a region or running the company. People who had done the physical work of running a restaurant understood things that people who had only managed one never quite could. Senior leadership at McDonald's has, to an unusual degree across its history, come from inside the kitchen. Joan Kroc deserves more space in this story than she usually gets. Ray's wife inherited much of his estate, when he died in 1984. What she chose to do with it is, frankly, remarkable, and almost entirely absent from how McDonald's is usually discussed. She gave away hundreds of millions of dollars to public radio. Her donation to National Public Radio was among the largest in its history, to university peace studies programs, to community recreation centers in working-class neighborhoods, and to the Salvation Army, $1.5 billion in a single gift. Not a misprint, $1.5 billion. Joan Croc's name is on public radio stations across America and on community buildings in cities people rarely think about in connection with McDonald's. She is essentially unknown in any conversation about the company. The fortune Ray Kroc accumulated by building something ordinary, and the way his wife then gave most of it away. Those two things are part of the same story, and the second half tends to get left out entirely. Then there are the people whose names don't appear anywhere at all. The franchise operators in small towns who kept their restaurants clean and consistent through years when the economy was difficult and the margins were thin. The kitchen workers who showed up before dawn and stayed through the lunch rush. The managers who read the training manuals and tried, every shift, to actually meet the standard rather than approximate it. They're why it worked. Part 10. Criticism, adaptation, and the question of change. No story this size runs clean, and there's no reason to pretend otherwise. The nutritional concerns around McDonald's food are real. A diet heavy in what McDonald's serves, saturated fat, sodium, refined carbohydrates in significant quantities, is associated with health outcomes that public health organizations have spent decades documenting. The company's scale makes this a legitimate public health matter, not simply a question of individual choice. When a single company shapes the dietary habits of tens of millions of people daily, what it puts on its menu has consequences that go beyond any individual order. The 2004 documentary, Supersize Me, brought this into popular focus in a way that was hard to dismiss. Morgan Spurlock ate McDonald's for every meal for 30 days and documented the effects. The film was widely seen. McDonald's retired the supersize option later that year. Whether the documentary directly caused the change, or whether the change was already being considered, is one of those questions that never fully resolves. Probably both things are true. Over subsequent years, salads appeared. Apple slices were offered as a fries alternative in children's meals. Calorie counts went up on menu boards. Cooking oils changed. Low-fat milk arrived as a drink option. The response has been gradual, and by most critics' reading, insufficient. The core product hasn't changed in any fundamental sense. A Big Mac in 2024 is not nutritionally different in any meaningful way from a Big Mac in 1984. McDonald's is not going to reinvent itself as a salad company, but the company isn't completely deaf to the conversation either. The labor argument has been sharper and more sustained. The fight for 15, the campaign pushing for a $15 federal minimum wage in the United States, drew many of its most visible voices from fast food workers. McDonald's, as the most recognizable name in the industry, became central to the debate whether it chose to be or not. Workers staged strikes outside restaurants. The arguments ran nationally for several years. Minimum wages in many American states have since risen, partly as a result of that sustained pressure. McDonald's has raised starting wages in some markets. The conversation about fair pay for that kind of work continues. And the answers aren't uniform across the different economic contexts in which McDonald's operates. These things don't resolve cleanly. They're part of what it means for a company to operate at this scale. Choices about wages and nutrition and packaging carrying real consequences out into the world. Part 11. The geography of arches. Approximately 40,000 McDonald's restaurants exist in the world, more than 100 countries, something around 69 million customers per day. That last number is close to the entire population of the United Kingdom, visiting McDonald's every single day. The scale is genuinely difficult to hold in your head as a real thing rather than an abstraction. Lay the locations out on a map, and the picture that forms tells you several things at once. Where people live in high enough density to support the model. Where infrastructure and consumer spending have reached a certain threshold. The geography of a particular kind of modernity, or something close to that. The map is dense across North America and Europe and East Asia. It thins in Central Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. It exists in places that would have seemed improbable franchise locations 40 years ago. Former Soviet republics, markets that were effectively closed to Western commercial activity within living memory. Economists at one point used McDonald's presence as a rough developmental signal, an indicator that a country had reached a certain level of political stability and commercial infrastructure. Not a precise measure, and shaped partly by McDonald's own strategic decisions and franchise partnerships. But the instinct behind the observation wasn't entirely misplaced. The company's model requires a functioning road network, a reliable supply chain, a sufficient level of disposable resources, and a commercial and legal environment stable enough to protect the long-term investment. Where those things exist, McDonald's tends to appear. Where they don't, it usually doesn't. The Big Mac Index emerged from this in 1986, created by The Economist magazine, a deliberately light-hearted but genuinely useful tool. The Big Mac is made from broadly similar ingredients in most countries, providing a consistent baseline product. Compare its price across different markets, adjusted for local wages and currency exchange rates, and you get a rough sense of whether a given currency is over or undervalued relative to what it can actually buy. Economists use it in real analysis. It turns up in academic papers. The fact that a fast food sandwich has become a legitimate instrument of economic comparison is either funny or telling, or both simultaneously, depending on your disposition. The index has limitations. Local ingredient costs vary, franchise fees differ, and cultural factors affect pricing in ways that purchasing power alone doesn't explain. But as a quick and accessible comparison tool, it has lasted for nearly 4 decades, which suggests it's doing something useful. Part 12. Familiarity as currency. There's a concept in psychology called the mere exposure effect. The core finding: familiarity breeds preference. The more we encounter something without harm, the more positively we tend to feel about it. Not through deliberate judgment, just through accumulated presence. McDonald's has benefited from this more than almost any other commercial entity in history. The golden arches appear in so many contexts. roads, airports, town centres, glimpsed from motorways, that they've stopped registering as the presence of anything in particular. They're part of how the world looks. Background, furniture, that quality of embedded presence, of being so consistently in the same places over so many decades that you've become part of the texture of daily life, rather than something people consciously notice. It's extraordinarily valuable, more valuable probably than any individual advertising campaign. You can't buy it directly. It accumulates. Part 12. B. The language of the arches. McDonald's has always understood how to speak. Not perfectly. There are campaigns in the archive that haven't aged well, and a few that were peculiar even at the time, but with a general instinct for what the moment was asking for. You Deserve a Break Today ran through much of the 1970s. The campaign was developed by Needham, Harper, and Steers, an advertising agency then based in Chicago. The 1970s were, for many Americans, genuinely exhausting. Inflation high, political mood difficult, the optimism of the previous decade spent. The idea that visiting McDonald's was a small, self-awarded respite, a break you'd earned just by showing up to your life, landed with real resonance. Simple, warm, true enough. Mac Tonight came in the late 1980s, a moonlit figure in sunglasses playing a grand piano, suggesting McDonald's as an option for the evening hours, not just lunch. There was an attempt here to give the brand a slightly cooler, more relaxed nocturnal quality. The character itself is viewed now quite strange. A crescent moon with a human body, dressed in a suit, playing jazz outside what appears to be a McDonald's in California. Whether the campaign moved sales in any measurable way is debatable, but it ran for several years, which suggests someone believed in it. Then I'm Lovin' It, which arrived in 2003 and has simply not left. The campaign emerged through a collaboration involving High and Partner, a German advertising agency, and was co-written in part by Pharrell Williams, a successful producer and collaborator at the time, not yet the household name he'd become. The grammatical imperfection in I'm lovin' it rather than I love it was reportedly deliberate, present tense, immediate, alive in the moment rather than declarative. Not a permanent commitment, just right now, this is good. It launched globally, in multiple markets, multiple languages, simultaneously. The music drove much of it, because music travels across language barriers more cleanly than copy does. In markets where the phrase itself was translated, the underlying quality of immediacy was retained. More than 20 years later, it's still running. Most advertising campaigns are considered successful if they survive 3 years before audiences tire of them. I'm Lovin' It has moved past advertising entirely. It functions as language now, not something you consciously register as belonging to McDonald's, but a phrase so embedded in the cultural atmosphere that it has effectively escaped the brand that coined it. Part 13. The playgrounds and the happy meals. McDonald's has always understood children. That sentence can be read several ways, and both readings are probably accurate. The Happy Meal was introduced in 1979, and it didn't come from corporate headquarters. It came from a franchise operator in Guatemala named Yolanda Fernandez de Cofino, who created a smaller portioned meal in a box designed specifically for children. The concept spread, was adopted globally, and became one of the most effective product ideas in the history of the food industry. The toy inside is worth pausing on. Over the decades, McDonald's has partnered with film studios and toy companies to place collectibles inside those boxes. Figures, games, characters, tied to whatever film or franchise was current at the time. Children have collected them, debated them, traded them at school, left them lined up on bedroom windowsills. The Happy Meal toy has been the subject of more earnest parental negotiation than perhaps any other object of comparable size. The toy makes the Happy Meal an event rather than a meal, something anticipated specifically, not lunch at McDonald's, but the day I finally got the one I wanted. That's a different category of memory from most restaurant visits. The playgrounds extend the same logic into physical space. A brightly colored play structure turns the restaurant into a destination. The child in the playground isn't experiencing fast food. They're experiencing the place with the climbing frame, the slide, the thing their friends talked about. That distinction shapes memory in ways that outlast the food by decades. Part 14. The night shift. There's a version of McDonald's that doesn't appear in the advertising. The 24-hour rollout, which expanded significantly through the 1990s and 2000s, came from data showing consistent demand in the hours when most restaurants had closed. Somebody was hungry at 2 in the morning, reliably, in enough locations to justify staying open. A lot of somebodies, it turned out. The late-night customer is not one kind of person. Night shift workers finishing long hours, nurses, factory workers, security staff, cleaners, the people who keep things running while everyone else sleeps. Students emerging from libraries or computer rooms at midnight with the particular hollow hunger of someone who has been working too hard for too many hours. Truck drivers on motorways, pulling into service areas, not because they want to, but because there is nowhere else open within a reasonable distance. Hospital staff in the gap between one emergency and the next. People coming back from concerts or late films, a little overstimulated, not yet ready to go home and face the quiet. For all of them, the lit restaurant at 3 in the morning means something more than food. There's a specific quality to an open building in a dark street at that hour. Evidence that things are still running, that the world hasn't simply shut down and gone to bed, leaving you alone with whatever the night contains. Films and novels use the late-night McDonald's as a setting deliberately, and they do it repeatedly enough that you start to notice the pattern. It's almost always a transitional space. Characters are there between one thing and the next, passing through, figuring something out, waiting for the night to turn. The food is almost incidental in those scenes. What matters is the light and the warmth and the fact that someone is there. The staff running those locations through the small hours, keeping the kitchen moving, maintaining the standard, serving the tired and the in-between, don't receive much recognition for what they're doing. It's demanding work at unusual hours, sustained reliably across thousands of locations most nights of the year. The particular discipline of maintaining quality at 3 in the morning, when no one above you in the organization is watching, and the easiest thing would be to let things slide a little. That's not nothing. Part 15. Reinvention in the digital age. By the early 2000s, McDonald's had a real problem. The health conversation had developed actual momentum. Documentaries were being made. Books were selling. A book called Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser, published in 2001, covered the industry's history and practices in considerable depth and reached a very large readership. It became a reference point for people who had vague concerns about fast food and wanted a specific vocabulary for them. The cultural mood around fast food had shifted, and McDonald's, most visible target, largest name, was absorbing most of it. A new kind of competitor was also emerging. Chipotle, Shake Shack, Five Guys. These chains sold fast food in terms of speed and convenience, but wrapped in a different story. Fresher ingredients, more visible sourcing, menus that felt simpler and more deliberate. They appealed to a customer, particularly a younger customer, who wanted the convenience without the accumulated cultural associations. McDonald's response was gradual and, in a way, honest about its limits. It wasn't going to become Chipotle. It didn't try. It began adjusting at the margins, adding menu items that acknowledged the changing conversation, being more explicit about ingredients and sourcing. The McCafe concept developed and expanded, giving McDonald's a genuine foothold in the coffee category it hadn't previously owned. In Australia and several European markets, McCafe grew into something that competed directly with dedicated coffee chains. Not a transformation, an expansion. The digital shift required something more fundamental: mobile ordering, self-service kiosks that replaced the human counter interaction in many locations, loyalty apps with points and personalized offers, a customer who expects to have decided what they want and possibly already paid before arriving at the door. McDonald's had built its operational model around a specific sequence. Person approaches counter, speaks to employee, food is produced. Digital integration disrupts that sequence at multiple points, and rethinking a sequence that has been stable for 60 years means revisiting kitchen layout, training, the physical organization of the space, and the order in which things happen. The transition has not been frictionless. Technology brings its own complications. System outages, app failures, the occasional queuing problem that the kiosk was supposed to eliminate. And some customers simply prefer talking to a person. The human counter hasn't disappeared. It exists alongside the new systems. The drive-thru, which now handles the majority of transactions at most locations, has been heavily optimized. Pre-ordering through apps, license plate recognition in some markets, predictive ordering systems, the fundamental orientation, finding the customer at whatever point they're at and making the transaction as easy as possible remain. The tools are just different. Part 16. The Archers in Unexpected Places. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, it was one of the most significant political events in living memory. Within 13 months, a McDonald's had opened in East Berlin, December 1990. The queue that day was long, not because food was unavailable elsewhere in East Berlin, but because of what going there meant. People who had spent decades inside a closed system, ordering a Big Mac in a city where that had recently been impossible. A very small, very concrete participation in the world that had been on the other side. People stood in it. Some brought their children. A few people brought their parents, who had spent most of their lives in a divided city and had simply wanted to see it. Moscow actually came first. January 1990. because the Soviet negotiations had been running for years. The deal was struck between McDonald's Canada and the Soviet government, and it had required an unusual kind of bilateral patience, years of talks, of approvals, of establishing supply chains that could operate within a Soviet economic context. The Pushkin Square location, when it finally opened, drew an estimated 30,000 customers that first day. The queue stretched around the block and held up for hours. People stood in the January cold and waited, talking, eventually making a decision, ordering, eating. For many of them, it wasn't the food. It was the act of choosing something from a menu and receiving exactly that, at a posted price, in a clean space. Something that sounds completely unremarkable until you consider the specific context in which it was happening. In 2022, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine prompted responses from companies and governments across the world, McDonald's closed all of its Russian restaurants. After more than 30 years, after becoming part of the daily routine of millions of Russian customers, after the Golden Arches had become part of the streetscape of dozens of Russian cities, as familiar and unremarkable as any other commercial presence, it simply left. The symbol that had once represented openness had, in a different moment, become a symbol of something else entirely. That's what happens to things that have been present long enough to accumulate meaning they didn't originally choose. Part 17. The people who grew up behind the counter line in 8 Americans had, at some point in their life, worked for McDonald's. That statistic gets quoted often enough that it can start to feel abstract. But 1 in 8, in a country of 330 million people, represents an enormous shared experience. First jobs, early morning, shift schedules, performance reviews, learning how to keep functioning alongside other people under the low-level pressure of a service environment. For a lot of those people, McDonald's was where they first understood what it meant to show up somewhere reliably, to do a task correctly under time pressure, as part of a team that depended on you completing your piece at the right moment. The skills are not trivial. They tend to get underestimated by people who have never had to develop them. The job has a particular texture. You're on your feet throughout. The pace shifts, slow for stretches, then suddenly very fast as the lunch rush arrives, and every movement matters. Then slow again. You're working in a small physical space with other people, constantly adjusting, communicating in the abbreviated shorthand that develops between colleagues who run the same station every day. You learn to read the rhythm of a shift. You learn which tasks need doing before they're asked for. You learn patience from the outside in, which is a different kind of patience from the kind you might choose to develop. Some moved on to completely unrelated careers, taking that background with them. A practical understanding of reliability and systems that shows up in ways that are hard to attribute directly, but real. Others stayed and found within the company a trajectory they hadn't anticipated. Andy McKenna, former chairman of McDonald's USA, Jeff Stratton, who served as president, both came up from within the organization, from operational roles, from the kitchen. When the people making senior decisions have stood in the positions affected by those decisions, something in the culture is different, not always better, but different in ways that tend to matter. Part 18. The sensory world of a familiar place. The smell arrives first. That specific combination of frying oil and toasted buns and something faintly sweet, immediately recognizable in a way that moves faster than thinking. Smell is the most direct route to memory, more so than sound or image. And McDonald's has accidentally created one of the most widely distributed olfactory triggers in human history. It's strange when you consider it directly. A scent that is recognizable to more people on Earth than almost any other commercial smell. For a lot of people, that smell doesn't pull them into the present. It pulls them somewhere earlier, to being small, to specific Saturdays, to the back seat of a car on a long journey, to the particular quality of happiness that comes from being somewhere uncomplicated. The sounds operate more quietly, but they're there. The soft percussion of ice going into a cup, the click of a lid being pressed on, the low, constant rhythm of a kitchen always in motion, timers going, brief exchanges between staff moving around each other, with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this shift before and will do it again tomorrow. None of it remarkable individually. Together, it forms a texture that's recognizable, even from outside the building. The colors, the specific red and yellow, were not chosen by accident. Red activates. It stimulates appetite and creates a sense of energy. Yellow is legible from distance and carries a particular cheerfulness that reads as welcoming rather than sophisticated. Together, they produce a palette that is warm and slightly insistent, not relaxing, but open in a very direct way. The combination has been tested, adjusted, and refined across decades. The version of red and yellow you see on a McDonald's sign today is not exactly the version from 1960. It's been tuned. The newer interiors have softened all of this considerably. Wood tones, upholstered seating, warmer light. Some locations have plants and artwork on the walls, and seating arrangements that suggest a cafe rather than a canteen. The effect is less, move through quickly, and more, stay as long as you need to. The customer changed first. They started wanting to sit, to work on a laptop, to meet someone for coffee that happened to cost less than the coffee shop across the street. And the spaces followed. This is how McDonald's tends to operate. The customer leads, the company adjusts, usually slowly, but it adjusts. Part 19. The competitors and the conversation. McDonald's didn't build its position in an empty landscape. Burger King emerged in the 1950s, roughly concurrent with the Croc era. The flame grilling proposition, we cook differently, and differently means better, was positioned directly against McDonald's fried patties from the beginning. Burger King spent decades trying to establish that distinction in the consumer mind, with mixed results. McDonald's largely ignored it. When you have the scale and embedded familiarity that McDonald's had accumulated by the 1970s, continuing to exist at that scale is sometimes the whole competitive strategy. You don't need to win the argument. You just need to stay open. Wendy's arrived in 1969. Dave Thomas, the founder, had genuine convictions about quality. Square patties, never frozen. Freshness built into the brand's identity from day one. The square patty was a deliberate visual statement too. The corners extend beyond the round bun, so customers can see what they're actually getting. Thomas said his mother had taught him not to cut corners. He turned that into product design, which is, whatever else you say about it, a fairly memorable piece of brand communication. Wendy's never approached McDonald's scale. but it built a loyal following and a reputation that has been remarkably consistent. The "Where's the Beef" campaign from the early 1980s is the Wendy's moment that entered the wider culture. Clara Peller, looking at an undersized burger on an oversized bun and asking, with magnificent directness, where the actual meat was. The campaign named no one specifically, but the implication was broad. The phrase spread well beyond advertising, used by politicians during primary debates, by journalists questioning corporate claims, by anyone wanting to express the particular skepticism that applies when something promises more than it contains. Clara Peller was 81 at the time of filming. She delivered the line with a directness that appears, on viewing the original advertisement, completely unperformed. Whether that's acting or just how she was is genuinely unclear. The fast, casual wave of the 2000s and 2010s, Chipotle, Shake Shack, Five Guys, operates on a different axis entirely. These chains aren't competing on price or speed. They're competing on identity. The customer choosing Chipotle is, in some cases, making a statement about who they are and what they value, not just what they feel like eating. That's a harder position to counter with menu adjustments. McDonald's hasn't really countered the identity problem, and it hasn't seriously tried. The brand carries decades of associations that can't be quickly repositioned, and attempting to do so would confuse the customers who aren't bothered by those associations, which is most of them. Instead, it is focused on what it can control: value, speed, consistency, and now digital convenience. Those things have kept it ahead in volume, even as parts of the cultural conversation drifted in a different direction. Part 20. The invisible labor of ordinary things: roads, running water, electricity. The signs that direct you without your having to wonder who installed them or why they're there. McDonald's belongs to that same category for a large portion of the world. Simply present, part of the landscape, requiring no active decision, no deliberate attention. Behind every transaction at a drive-through window, behind the ordinary act of handing over a few coins and receiving something hot and expected, there is an enormous amount of invisible effort. Every arch was designed by someone. Every procedure was refined through years of testing and adjustment. Every franchise agreement was negotiated. Every training program was written, piloted, rewritten. Every restaurant was located, built, staffed, and held to a standard across decades. The coordination required to produce a single unremarkable Tuesday lunchtime, multiplied by 69 million customers a day, is extraordinary. We don't think about it. We're not supposed to. Part 21. Speed built on patience. A quiet irony sits at the center of this. McDonald's is a company built around speed. The kitchen, the menu, the ordering process, the drive-through, the packaging. All of it optimized, refined, relentlessly improved in the direction of reducing the time between wanting something and having it. Speed is, in some fundamental sense, the product. The company itself has moved very slowly. The systems that make a McDonald's kitchen fast were developed through years of painstaking iteration. The real estate portfolio was built property by property across decades. Supplier relationships grew gradually through commitments maintained over long periods. The brand, that quality of embedded familiarity, of the golden arches as background rather than foreground, accumulated through consistent presence over more than 50 years. The fastest restaurant in the world was built with extraordinary patience. The visible part moves quickly. The invisible part never rushed. Part 22. The long view. The 20th century was the century of the system, of standardization, of the discovery that the same thing, done reliably at scale, could reach people in numbers that previous generations couldn't have imagined. McDonald's is one of the clearest expressions of that discovery. The 21st century has pulled in a different direction, toward the local, the handmade, the small and specific and irreplaceable, farmers markets, artisan bakeries, food with a named place of origin and a person attached to it. The appeal is genuine. In a world of increasing uniformity, specificity feels like it carries real value. McDonald's is not specific in that sense. It is the opposite of specific, and deliberately so. But consistency and affordability and reliability are not minor conveniences for many people. They're the difference between eating well enough and not, between a family finding something they can afford on a Tuesday evening and not finding it. The person with time to seek out the artisan bakery and the income to afford it is not the same person as the one working 2 jobs with children who need something quick and dependable. Both people's needs are real. They require different answers. Part 23. What the children remember. The children who visited McDonald's with their parents on ordinary days are, many of them, adults now. What they remember is not supply chains or franchise agreements or real estate models or advertising strategy. They remember the smell when the door opened, the particular weight of a plastic tray, the sound of ice dropping into a waxed cup, the specific excitement of lifting the lid off the Happy Meal box and seeing which toy was in there, the entirely serious negotiation about whether this one was better than the one their friend had gotten. They remember sitting across from someone, a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, someone they loved without particularly thinking about it. In the uncomplicated way children love the people who are simply there. They remember an ordinary day going well. McDonald's was part of that day, not the source of the happiness, the location of it, the place where the afternoon happened. Closing. The story of McDonald's is still being written, in boardrooms and kitchens and franchise meetings, in countries that would have seemed unlikely locations for this particular story 40 years ago, in menus adjusting for new tastes, in a supply chain being slowly, unevenly, imperfectly remade, in the ongoing decisions about wages and packaging and sourcing that will shape what the brand means to the generation currently growing up around it. We've covered a lot of ground, from a modest restaurant in San Bernardino and the pair of brothers who just wanted to make good burgers consistently, through a milkshake salesman in a California car park who saw something no one else had quite seen yet, through the real estate insight that changed the financial shape of everything, through the expansion, country by country, each with its own texture and complications, through the food, the fries, the characters, the campaign, through the criticisms and the competitions, and the long, slow, mostly invisible work of building something that several billion people alive today have been part of at some point. And underneath all of that, underneath the scale and the strategy and the familiar yellow and red, the same small act, repeated tens of millions of times each day, Someone asks for something, someone else makes it. It arrives. And for a moment, something ordinary happens exactly as it should. Sleep well.